everyone. My name is Sanders Kleinfeld, and it's my pleasure to welcome Rizwan Virk to Talks at Google today. He's here to discuss his new book, The Simulated Multiverse, which explores how the scientific mysteries of our reality might be explained by the interplay of two theories. First, the simulation hypothesis, which proposes that we are living in a simulation, and second, the concept of the multiverse, which proposes that there exists a multiplicity of interconnected timelines that represent the outcome of different possible events that occur in space-time. Rizwan Virk is the founder of Play Labs at MIT, which is an accelerator program for startups focused on using playful technologies in a wide range of industries. He's also a venture partner at Griffin Gaming Partners, as well as a Silicon Valley founder, advisor, and investor in a variety of startups, including GameView Studios, Tapjoy, and Discord. Riz is also an indie film producer whose credits include the movies Thrive, What on Earth Will It Take?, Knights of Badassdom, and The Outpost, as well as the author of the books The Simulation Hypothesis, Startup Myths and Models, What You Won't Learn in Business School, Zen Entrepreneurship, and Treasure Hunt. Thanks so much for joining us, Riz.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be back at Google, although virtually this time.
It's so great to have you. So, as I alluded to in my intro, you're quite a polymath. What specifically drew you to this somewhat esoteric area of research into the nature of reality?
Well, I was an entrepreneur for many years and then an investor doing venture capital type investing in the video game industry. And so, when you're working on your startup day to day, you don't really have time to think about these big questions of what is the nature of reality, although you might do it over a few beers. But a few years ago, when I had sold one of my startups to a company in Marin, I was visiting their offices and we were, sitting there looking out over the bay at San Francisco, and they said, "Oh, we're building a virtual reality table tennis game. Do you want to try it out?" I said, "Sure." And so I put on the headset and I started to play this VR ping pong game. And by the end of the game, I completely forgot that I was inside virtual reality. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. But of course, there was no table and the controller fell to the floor. And that's when I started to realize that, immersiveness is an aspect of the technology that we're building in video games, and it's going to continue. So I started to speculate on what would it take to build something like the Matrix, which is 100% full immersion, and you have no idea that you're inside a game. And I realized that we're already on that path. And so that was what started me down this whole rabbit hole of simulation theory, was by speculating, how our technology would evolve to what I call the simulation point, the point at which our virtual reality is indistinguishable from physical reality.
Awesome. So before we delve into all the fascinating specifics, I was wondering if you could summarize for us the thesis of your book. What does it mean to say that we're living in a simulated multiverse?
Well, my previous book, The Simulation Hypothesis, could be summed up by saying we live in a computer simulation. And I came to that conclusion not just because of the areas of technology that I can talk more about that I just mentioned, but also because I started to look into quantum physics and some of the baffling findings and mysteries, and realized that they made much more sense in a simulated world than in a single physical reality. I also ended up looking into a lot of the traditional religions, both the Eastern religions and the Western religions. And again, I came to the conclusion that what they had been telling us all along was that we live in something that is not the real world. What we think of as physical reality is some kind of illusion or dream. And so, that thesis is present in the current book as well. But in this book, I went a little deeper, and the main thesis is that we live in a simulated multiverse. And just as someone asked Voltaire once, who, when they were asking about past lives and reincarnation, said, "Isn't it strange that we live multiple times?" And he said, "Well, it's no stranger that we live multiple times than that we live once." And so, I guess the thesis of this book is that if we live in a computer simulated reality, there's no reason we wouldn't be in a multiverse. In fact, it might make more sense and might explain a lot of the other weirdness in quantum mechanics that, I didn't really have time to get into in the previous book. And so that really is the thesis, that there are multiple timelines that can be run. You can run, start, and stop a simulation pretty easily. Why do we run simulations? It's to see what would happen, right? With the weather, or we're forecasting the population or the spread of a disease, we enter different variables and we run them again and again. And so that really, in a nutshell, is what this book is about, is that is what may be happening with reality. And so it's kind of a what if experiment to say, if that's the case, how would it work and how would it explain all of these strange things out there?
Yeah, so speaking of strange things, I was fascinated by the discussion in the book of a phenomenon that's now called the Mandela Effect, in which large groups of people seemingly all share the same false memories or misperceptions of significant cultural events. I was wondering if you could share with us what you found in your research of the Mandela Effect.
Yeah, well, how I came across it is an interesting story. So, I was living in Mountain View, just down the road from Google's main offices there, and an old colleague of mine from MIT who had just started working for Google from Cambridge, coincidentally, he was in town in Mountain View, and he said, "Hey, let's have coffee." And so we did, and he had read my previous book about the simulation hypothesis, and he said, "Well, have you heard of this thing called the Mandela Effect?" And I said, "Yeah, I've heard of it. People remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison back in the 80s, but obviously he didn't die in prison in the 80s. He died much later." So I had kind of dismissed the Mandela effect as one of those fringe things. Not that I mind looking into fringe things, but I had kind of dismissed it, I think, as most mainstream scientists and technologists, would do, and to say it's just a case of faulty memory. And he said, "Well, the simulation hypothesis is the best explanation for something like the Mandela effect." And so I thought that was an interesting point. So I went and started to look into it and realized that the Mandela effect wasn't just about, a single event, which is Nelson Mandela, but there were many, many instances where a large group of people misremembered some aspect of reality. It could be a simple thing, a small thing like the line from The Empire Strikes Back, like where Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father." If you watch it, he doesn't say that. To entire episodes of Star Trek that people swear they saw again and again that never existed, to entire movies that never existed, to other events like the Reverend Billy Graham dying and Bill Clinton speaking at his funeral and then finding out he's still alive. And so, I began to research this and said, well, is it possible if these actually were alternate timelines and people were somehow remembering those timelines? And it turns out that it fits into this idea of a simulated reality where you can diverge, you can run different simulations, and you can come back. And so, that was an interesting kind of diversion, in my simulation research, but I thought it was a very colorful way to think about how this whole process could work. And I'm not necessarily saying that I 100% believe every Mandela effect out there. Like some people remember Jiffy peanut butter versus Jif peanut butter. I mean, a lot of those are probably simple mistakes. But then I would find what I call proximity, where, for example, a journalism major went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela and was told he was deathly sick and she couldn't meet with him, and then she came back and started working for NPR, and then they said he had died in prison. Now, the closer you are to something, like religious Christians who follow evangelical ministries like the Reverend Billy Graham would swear that they got a magazine saying that he had died and they had seen Bill Clinton speak at his funeral, you start to wonder, well, is there something weirder going on here that maybe is just hinting at the fringes of something in our reality? And so that's what led me down the rabbit hole again of simulation theory. And of course, the book talks about the Mandela effect, but really it's more about the mechanisms of how would a computer game work if there were to be multiple timelines, and how does that relate to physical reality as we know it.
Right, right. Earlier, you were mentioning the simulation point, which you discuss in your book, is the threshold beyond which we can create simulations that are indistinguishable from our own reality. So can you walk us through what you see as the technological milestones that we need to achieve in order to reach the simulation point?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the book, I laid out 10 stages on the road to the simulation point. And, the first few stages are about video games. Text adventure games were really the first games where there was an actual world inside the computer that you could explore. And you would explore it using text commands, so it wasn't very interesting. Then we had graphical video games, and today we have, three-dimensional MMORPGs, like Grand Theft Auto and World of Warcraft and many, many others, where you can actually explore this entire world, and you have an avatar representing you. We also have kind of rudimentary virtual reality and augmented reality. The glasses are still quite awkward. There's a lot of efforts now to reduce the size. Facebook and Ray-Ban are trying to bring out their augmented reality glasses that look like regular glasses. But so getting to photorealistic augmented reality and virtual reality is another stage that we are getting closer to. And that's not just about the number of pixels, it's about the responsiveness when you move. So it's really about the computing power that it would take. There's also light field displays, which is the ability to actually render an object in the physical world so that it looks like it's there based on how you bounce the light off the object. So we start to get closer to, what I call the holodeck stage, right? Where you could be in a room and you could be completely, you could be deceived as to what's actually there. You also have, quite a bit of kinesthetic research being done to how you could actually feel objects using little electrical signals. And so we're well down on the road. There's actually a company that makes what's called a Tesla suit, where you put on this entire suit and you can feel the sensations that were recorded in the suit. So they had a big rugby player in the UK, tackle somebody who had the suit, and you could put the suit on and you could feel it. And I remember thinking, well, that's not the first application that I would I would necessarily want to do. But so that's all, part of bringing the digital world closer. But where it really gets interesting is the brain-computer interfaces, right? And we're still in the early stages of those. And I talked about ping pong earlier, and there was a video with Elon Musk and Neuralink where they showed a monkey how to play a video game, and if you looked at the game, it was Pong. So for some reason, ping pong keeps coming up when we talk about this journey. But then they disconnected the joystick and just read the signals from the monkey's brain. In this case, it was invasive BCI with a chip that was planted, and the monkey was still able to control the video game, thinking that he was doing it using the joystick, but really he wasn't. And then we get to the stage where we can send information into the brain, and that one's still a little further away at this point. But then we get into interesting areas like false memories, which were explored in a lot of science fiction. One of my favorite science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick, who I'll talk about in a minute, who had a big impact on this book. Whereas in Blade Runner, for example, or Total Recall, why go on a vacation if you can get the memory and the memory seems as realistic to you as actually being there? We then get into having NPCs that can pass the Turing test. And so today our NPCs are pretty rudimentary, and we have interesting virtual characters out there like Little Michaela and others, and holograms of ABBA, the musical group ABBA with their avatars. But we haven't really married AI, and there's a few efforts to do that now out there. But once we have more realistic NPCs that live in the metaverse that can actually talk to us, we're getting closer and closer to what I call the simulation point. And then finally, the last stage is that we can download our consciousness completely into silicon, and now we start to get up to the definitions of what people call the singularity. But in this case, I refer to it as the simulation point, and you can have elements of it even before you get there. And so, what has happened since The Matrix came out? Of course, we have a new Matrix movie coming out now just in a few months, so there's a lot of excitement around simulation theory again. But when the first Matrix came out in 1999, all of these stages were pretty far off. There was no consumer virtual reality. BCI was in its infancy. And there was a paper by a professor named Nick Bostrom at Oxford that said, "Are you living in a computer simulation?" And he basically came up with the argument that, look, if any civilization ever gets to the simulation point, which he called becoming post-human, he said that civilization could make thousands, millions of simulations, and each of those could have billions of beings or trillions of beings. And so there were way more simulated realities than there are physical realities. There are way more simulated beings than there are physical beings. Therefore, if you are a being in a reality, which one are you more likely to be in? And so his argument was, if any civilization ever got to this point, then we are most likely in a simulation. He laid out a couple other possibilities, such as civilizations destroy themselves before they get to the simulation point. But I thought that was an interesting philosophical argument, and that was part of my research in thinking about this theoretical point. It's a kind of technological singularity, right? We think of singularity as being the robot apocalypse, right? Because that's what has gotten the most attention. But the term, has been around for a while. It was borrowed from physics and mathematics, but the idea was it was a point beyond which human civilization would be different. It was almost a point of no return. And I believe the simulation point is a kind of technological singularity. Once we reach that, once we can have experiences that are so immersive that we forget about the physical world, and then we have intelligences that can live within that virtual world, then humanity will never be the same again.
Right. So, speaking of like simulated consciousness, do you feel that we'll need to achieve artificial general intelligence (AGI) to get to that simulation point? And if so, do you have a sense of like how far away you think we are right now?
Well, that's obviously the big question that everyone
Mhm.
likes to speculate on, within Silicon Valley and beyond. But when I talk about simulation theory, I like to make a distinction between two versions of the simulation hypothesis, and I think it's kind of relevant to your question and the idea of AGI. And so I like to think of it as the NPC version of the simulation hypothesis, where you have a computer-generated simulation, but everyone within that simulation is just an NPC, right? They have a kind of consciousness within the simulation, but they don't exist outside of the simulation. A good example would be, if you want to use the Matrix as an example, you have Agent Smith, or the more recent movie Free Guy, right, where Ryan Reynolds played an NPC who was running the same events over and over again, which ties, more to this multiverse idea and the work of Philip K. Dick, which I will definitely talk about in a moment. But the other side of the coin is the RPG version, or the role-playing game version. And in that version, which is closer to our video games, we actually exist outside of the simulation, and then we have an avatar inside the simulation. And if you think of the word avatar, where does it come from? Well, it was used in modern video games for the first time in the 80s by a group out of Lucasfilm. They were making Star Wars and other games. So LucasArts was their video game company. But really, it's an old Sanskrit word that means to descend, right? And so we have this idea that we are descending from outside the world into this digital identity that's there. And so that's the RPG version, where we are PCs, or player characters. Now, it turns out these are not mutually exclusive, right? I mean, you can have NPCs in a video game, and you can have PCs in a video game. In fact, we do it all the time, right? Pretty much every game, Fortnite, World of Warcraft, you name it, there will be characters that are controlled within the game with very rudimentary AI. So I would say, as we get to the NPC version, we would definitely need to be closer to AGI in order to have it. But as we talk about the RPG version, we would have to be closer to having these brain-computer interfaces where we can forget that we are in there. So personally, I think we're a little bit further away from AGI than most people think. I have heard the estimates from Kurzweil and others of again the 2045, I think it was, or 2048, in that range. And I think that we're in the second wave of AI right now. Right, the first wave was expert system based, and you can go back and you'll see lots of optimism in the 80s about how AI is going to get there, and the Japanese were going to create artificial general intelligence by the end of the 80s, and there was all this optimism for it. And so that was the first wave, which was built on expert systems and rules. Now we're in the data based wave of AI, right, where we use data and we use machine learning and lots of examples and training. And my guess is there may need to be another wave that links those two somehow, or maybe introduces an unexpected element. That's why it's unexpected. I can't tell you what it is before we get there. So I think we're a little further away than a decade or two, but not more than a century away, in my opinion.
So you think if we're living in a simulation, it's more likely an RPG simulation than an NPC simulation? Or maybe, the technology that created the simulation is so far ahead of us that it could be either way.
Yeah, I actually think it's a combination, right? So when most academics talk about being in a simulation, they're talking about the NPC version primarily, right? But I think the RPG version is actually quite interesting, because people will say, well, who's outside the simulation? Who's running it, right? Is it some kind of, overlords? Is it a guy in his basement? And I say, well, what if it's us, right? We chose, just in the same way that we chose to be inside a video game, playing that game and being immersed within it for a period of time. It could be us outside of the game, and that to me is why it ties much more closely into what different religions, particularly the Eastern religions, about where you go in, you play a game for a certain period of time, you come out, you then go in and you have another avatar. And so my personal opinion is that it's some combination of the two. And I think we're seeing as our technology develops, more and more of our interaction is virtual, right? I mean, I'm not really talking to you right now. I'm
That's true.
talking to my computer, and those bits are being transferred over the internet, and they are being re-rendered on your screen. So I believe something like that is going on, even when we are interacting with each other, right? As Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, said in The Matrix, what is real? These are just electrical signals, that are being sent into your brain, and so each of us has a rendering device. Each of the player characters has a rendering device, right? The NPCs don't necessarily need that, and we are interacting with each other in this way. And today's social media is sort of a proxy for that. Right? We are developing these digital entities online, and then with all of this talk about the metaverse and having virtual avatars, we're getting closer and closer to building these identities, and then people take these identities very seriously. If you've spent time inside a virtual world like Second Life, right? I mean, people get married, they have kids, they have affairs, right? They have jobs, right? There is, people get associated so much that they almost forget. I mean, obviously these days with a 2D screen, we're not quite there yet, but my point is when we get to the simulation point, we may actually be there. So, I tend to lean a little more on the RPG side, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think that, that's why I included enough stages in this road to the simulation point that includes both the RPG version and the NPC version. So theoretically, we could get there, without a couple of those stages. But I'm thinking of like a full, reality, immersive reality that can include what seem like conscious NPCs and what might even be a digital afterlife if we were able to download our consciousness by mapping our connectome to get there.
Very cool, like a hybrid. So yeah, switching gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about the second component of the simulated multiverse, the multiverse component of the theory. I was wondering if you could explain that in a little bit more depth. Specifically, you talk a lot about the many worlds interpretation of the universe that a bunch of physicists actually subscribe to.
Yeah, I do. So if you think of the mysteries of quantum mechanics, right? They kind of came from the original the double slit experiment,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of a particle being in superposition, being in multiple places, or having multiple values for a property, or being both a wave and a particle. And the two most popular interpretations of that over the past century or so have been what's called the Copenhagen interpretation, which is this idea that there is a probability wave of all the probabilities, and that those get collapsed down to a single probability. And then there is the quantum multiverse, or the many worlds interpretation, which was put forward by Hugh Everett back in the 1960s for his PhD thesis at Princeton. And this says that every time that there is a quantum decision to be made, that it's actually spawning off another universe. So, there's actually two of you, two of me, and then those split into an additional two. And, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, was a little uncomfortable with this idea of things existing in multiple states. So he came up with the thought experiment of Schrödinger's cat, which we've all heard of, right? So a cat
Mm-hmm.
is placed in a box with some poison and some radioactive material that has a 50% chance of going off in an hour. So in an hour, there's a 50% chance of the cat being alive and a 50% chance of the cat being dead, right? Now, common sense tells us it can't be both. I mean, the cat is either alive or dead. We just don't know because we haven't opened the box. So as soon as we open the box, we'll look at it. And what quantum mechanics seems to be telling us is that the cat is in a state of superposition, and that both of those possibilities exist either as probabilities in the Copenhagen interpretation or as actual separate physical universes in the many worlds interpretation. And that when we open up the box, we either collapse the probability wave or we are just realizing that we're in one of these. And so, the multiverse theory is quite interesting, and many physicists, have come to become advocates of it. The main complaint against the Copenhagen interpretation has been, well, there's no math that gets you from the probability wave to the collapse in the observation or the measurement. And so some people like John von Neumann, who was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, thought that along with Eugene Wigner, that there is a consciousness component to this. And of course, scientists don't like that, right? When you bring in consciousness, you're now in kind of these metaphysical areas. And they said, well, are there any other alternatives? And, the many worlds interpretation sat in obscurity because Einstein didn't like it and Niels Bohr didn't like it. But over the years, many physicists found, well, the math works using this idea of interference and superposition of waves, that if all of these possibilities exist as multiple worlds, and you can think of it as multiple timelines. I think of it like the Loki, if you've seen the Marvel streaming series Loki, where they could actually watch a multiverse being born. It was like a tree with many strands. And a lot of superheroes, shows have picked up on this idea of the multiverse. But, within that interpretation, the main complaint, though, has been that it's not parsimonious. In fact, you need all these physical worlds being created all the time, every single instant, right? And so, both of the two major interpretations have some issues, according to some folks. And so I looked at simulation theory and realized that simulation theory gives us a framework, that may bridge the gap between these two different ways of looking at the world. The Copenhagen interpretation as a rendering mechanism, right? If you think of video games and how they work, the entire 3D space is not pre-rendered, right? And so if you were to try to build Fortnite or World of Warcraft back in the 80s, the computer scientists would say, well, we don't have enough processing power. We don't know how to keep track of all these pixels. There's just too many particles, right? Which is, interestingly enough, one of the arguments physicists have against simulation theory. There are too many particles, we can't keep track of it. But the reason we're able to have a Fortnite and a World of Warcraft and Cyberpunk 2077, if they ever work out the bugs, is because we were able to optimize, and we only need to render that which can be seen by the avatar or by the character. And so it kind of resolves this problem. Quantum indeterminacy becomes an optimization issue. Now, what's interesting about the multiverse theory is that there is something that can be cloned very quickly. We don't know of anything. We don't know of any natural process where an entire planet can be cloned, or an entire tree can be cloned in an instant. It can happen over time, right? You can try to grow a clone of a sheep. You can do, all of these things but even biological processes don't work that quickly. However, cloning of information is very fast. And in fact, if you optimize, so getting back to everything in computers, programming and implementation, and often in computer science comes down to optimization, right? And so, if there are only two possibilities, you don't have to make a copy of everything to be able to navigate those two possibilities. You just need to have the extra bits. And so in the book, I lay out this idea of the multiverse graph, which is a graph of all the possibilities, right? Think of it as Loki's tree of multiverse on steroids. That is every single possibility. And every single one of those possibilities is a game state in a video game. And I'm talking to folks at Google, so everyone knows how game states are represented as a bunch of bits that are stored, on Google Cloud or, AWS or wherever else. But, you represent the state of the character and the state of the world up on a server, and then you send that off to the individual people. And so, for me, simulation theory and this idea of a simulated multiverse provides an alternative way to think about all these different realities being spun off. And pulled together. And so this, brings me back to, why I got interested in this idea that we can run a simulation again and again. And it wasn't just because of the Mandela Effect. As part of my previous book, I had interviewed the wife of Philip K. Dick, who not only who's had so many great, novels that have been turned into movies like Blade Runner or The Man in the High Castle, but supposedly his work was part of the inspiration for the Wachowskis in the creation of The Matrix. And so he had a very famous statement, which was about, us living in a computer programmed reality back in 1977. And so when I was writing my first book, I looked at his speech, talked to his wife, and I thought, well, this guy believes some very strange things. He started to believe that not only were we in a computer simulated reality, but that there were multiple timelines being run. And so I went back to that speech in Metz, France, and realized that maybe the computer program reality part of it wasn't the most interesting part. There was another part to the speech. And I think we actually have that video clip. So I think I'd like to go ahead and play it for our audience. It's just a minute long that talks about, his theory of what was actually going on and why it led me into writing the simulated multiverse. So perhaps we can go ahead and play it. Right. So, that was an interesting, the idea that he had. And the more I delved into it, the more I realized what he was really talking about was this idea of changing a variable and rerunning a process to see where it would go, and then coming back and changing a variable again. And as we think about, the search space of a multiverse, if you were to navigate, why would you do that? Why would you run processes multiple times? Well, you're running it to figure out either what is the likely outcome or what is the optimal outcome. Now, in his case, he ended up writing stories like The Adjustment Team, which was the basis for the movie The Adjustment Bureau, because he felt like there were little things in his life that felt a little off. But he also came to believe that there were other large timelines. For example, The Man in the High Castle, which was a very successful series recently from Amazon, where the Germans and the Japanese won World War II, and there was an alternate timeline. So Philip K. Dick came to believe that that was an actual timeline that actually ran, and that he had those memories come back to him. It was sort of what the Greeks in ancient times would call anamnesis, a kind of a loss of forgetfulness or a return of memory. And so, I found this fascinating, one, because it makes for great science fiction, but two, he said all we would need to do is to find a group of people like him who remembered an alternate present or alternate timeline. And that's what led me to this idea of the Mandela Effect. Here's, subgroups of people remembering alternate timelines. And so that led me to do kind of a big what if experiment to say, okay, what if there's something to this? And you'll notice this is about time. And it turns out that our understandings of time, are very strange, right? So the point of the simulation hypothesis was that space, the physical world, is not what we think it is. That it's actually maybe a set of pixelated environment that is being rendered for us. This book, The Simulated Multiverse, right, which is the one we're talking about now, is that time is not what we think it is. And so going back to quantum mechanics, there was a gentleman named John Wheeler, who worked with Einstein at Princeton and Niels Bohr and many other giants. And, he came up with this many interesting findings and thought experiments, but one of them was the delayed choice experiment. And the delayed choice experiment teaches us that time is something very different from what we think of it in normal everyday terms. And the best way to describe it is the cosmic delayed choice experiment, where imagine there's light from a quasar that's coming from 15 billion light years away or a billion light years away, and that there's something in the middle, like a galaxy or a black hole, that is a gravitationally large object. And the light has to go either to the left or the right. And let's suppose that that black hole is about a million light years away. And so we can set up detectors here to figure out which way the light went, to the left or to the right, today. But that decision would have had to have been made a million years ago. Right? And so what the delayed choice experiment seems to be telling us, and people have, I don't think Wheeler wasn't able to do it when he first proposed it, but people have tried different versions of it, is that it doesn't seem that until the measurement is made, the light is in a state of superposition. Right, and I use that word a lot. It's used in quantum computing. There's a whole chapter in the book about quantum computing as well. We use it for qubits and quantum superposition. But the point is, if that decision would have had to have been made a million years ago, how could it still be in superposition today? Which means either in the multiverse theory that both of those exist, or there's something strange going on with our notion of time. We don't really understand time. But this idea of being in a simulated multiverse gives us, the opportunity to really explain that in a completely different way, to say each of these is a possible set of paths through this multiverse graph. But when we make that measurement, we are then choosing a particular path and a particular rendering of that. So anyway, that was a bit of a long answer there in a few different ways, but that's kind of how some of this stuff comes together.
Yeah, relatedly to this discussion, one of the most counterintuitive and thought-provoking assertions that you make in the book, I think, is that we should consider not only that there are a variety of possible futures that could stem from our current moment in time, but also a variety of potential possible pasts from which we could have arrived at this point. And I was wondering if you could
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about how that works in terms of timelines.
Yeah, so I started to draw out timelines and said, well, if some people were to remember something slightly different, is it possible that in the Copenhagen interpretation we could have a different collapse of the particles of the probability wave? And there was an experiment proposed by Eugene Wigner called Wigner and Wigner's friend. And he said that if I were in a lab and I were to actually find a particular grouping of particles or a particular collapse, and I was not to communicate that with anyone, is it possible that somebody else who was in another lab might end up with a different collapse of those particles? And so, it came to this idea: could there be multiple potential presents? And we all understand the idea of multiple possible futures, right? Based on the choices we make today, there are multiple possible futures, and we will end up in one of those. But when we get into this idea of multiple possible paths, which is what the delayed choice experiment is at least hinting at, it means that we could have a branch of multiple timelines that are getting to the current point in time. The current point in time is one of many points in time, and then what we think of as possible futures, are based upon these choices, and so you end up with this kind of very large graph. And I think it's interesting that we don't often consider multiple possible paths because we think of the past as a fixed thing. Well, it turns out that Schrodinger himself back in the 1940s came up with this idea of multiple simultaneous histories. This was kind of a precursor to the whole multiverse theory that came out later. But what are multiple simultaneous histories? Well, they exist until you choose one, in a way, right? So it's like choose your own adventure, but you're choosing not just a future, but you're also choosing the past. And so that was kind of an intriguing idea to me. And so there's a lot of diagrams in the book, that kind of talk about, well, how would it work? I mean, if we think of the Mandela Effect and we say, okay, let's say we believe people who remember different timelines, just for argument's sake, right? Well, then you've got a group of people remembering timeline A, and you've got a group of people remembering timeline B. What happened to that other timeline? Was it cut off? This brings up bigger philosophical questions when you start to talk about timelines, right? In time travel stories, there's always this idea of the current timeline, like in Star Trek, in the episode Yesterday's Enterprise. They go back in time and they change something from a previous Enterprise that was supposed to be destroyed, and then they come to the future, and now they're in a completely different future. My question is, what happened to the other timeline, right? We would say, well, it never existed. Well, that's not quite right. It did exist because it was rendered. And so in a simulated universe, in a simulated multiverse, what it means for a timeline to exist is very different than what we think of as kind of this standard one-way approach. It means that particular path through the multiverse graph and the information that was associated with it was actually rendered up to a certain point. And in the same way that we would search a graph of possibilities in playing games, and as we train, we're talking at Google here. So, obviously DeepMind and AlphaGo, we have AlphaGo, and we have all of these different ways in which we train based upon different scenarios, right? So we use self-play to train AI across thousands or millions of games. And what if the universe is doing that already? What if it is actually running multiple versions of reality? And so there's a term that was coined by Stephen Wolfram, which is called computational irreducibility. And what that says is that you can't know the end result of a process that is not a stable process, but that is a chaotic or complex process, until you run the actual instructions. If you want to know what happens at step 5 million, you have to run step 4,999,999, and then you can get there. So what if the universe itself is a computationally irreducible process, and you have to run it multiple times to try to figure out what the best outcome is? And that's what Philip K. Dick was actually saying if you go back and watch his whole speech, or you read a transcript of it, that there were people existing outside of time that were running and watching these processes to figure out what is the best one. And we think we're in reality, but we're just one of these processes and one of the runs of these processes.
Yeah, so I was really fascinated by the proposal that you made in the latter chapter of the book about sort of the central logic that was governing this simulated multiverse potentially, and you referred to it as an algorithm called the core loop. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how that works when we're running all these simulations concurrently.
Yeah, so defined in a classical sense, the core loop is, very similar to how we used to create AI to play video games, right? It would basically say, this is the current state of the game. These are the next possible states of the game. Let's go forward in time. Let's run a simulation and say, okay, what if I do that? What are the next possible steps? And so you can think of it as kind of a branching structure, or a depth first search, within a graph, except the graph is actually the possible futures. So, I put together the proposal that perhaps we are actually trying to figure out what is happening in the future. And there are other interpretations of quantum mechanics that talk about messages being sent from multiple futures to us. Well, what does all that mean, right? These multiple probable futures. If you think of probability, where did it come from? It came from the idea of rolling a dice. And if you roll a dice, there are 6 possible futures, right? So this idea of probability and possible futures is tied together. And so the core loop is an algorithm, at least in a classical sense. And then, we talk about it from putting the bits in superposition so that it can be done in a parallel capacity, and coming back with the best path through the graph that we are trying to navigate. So that's really what the core loop is about. It's about finding the best or most optimal future for a specific player, and it's kind of almost an evolutionary algorithm that can run in parallel or can run more classically, to say, if the universe is going to evolve, let's try out these different things.
Right.
And each of us might be doing that ourselves, because if we all have rendering devices, we are rendering our own personal futures and trying to see what's best for me, what's best for you, and then we have to correlate those two and put them together.
Fascinating. This has been a great discussion, and I think we have a few questions from the audience. So let's pull one of them up. We have a question here from Romit. Do you think advancement in research in areas such as quantum superpositioning and quantum entanglement could prove that we are in a simulation? How would humanity deal with this if proven? So that's sort of 2 questions for you there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first question, the short answer is yes. I mean, I think more research into quantum superposition, could in fact show that, one, there is a multiverse, but 2, that multiverse may not be rendered all the time, or if it is, what is the central processing unit? What is the mechanism that allows for this multiverse to run? And so, there's a physicist at Oxford named David Deutsch, who was one of the pioneers of quantum computing. And, he makes the point that it would take a classical computer, how many thousands of years to break, a regular encryption that we use all the time on the internet, but that using Shor's algorithm, you're able to, cut the time down to a much more significant factor. And how's that possible if the number of possibilities we need to explore is more than the number of atoms in the universe? And he makes the point that it's because we're exploring all these in parallel, and then we're using interference to find the right one. So I think that understanding not just the math of superposition or entanglement, which is of course a very interesting area of further research. Personally, I think entanglement has something to do with optimization, right? And I like to make the point that the reason I can stream Game of Thrones, on my iPhone, is because, like, in those scenes of winter, all the pixels are white, right? So if pixels have the same value, then it's pretty easy to compress that information and optimize them. And I mentioned John Wheeler earlier, and he had a famous phrase, and his famous phrase was "it from bit." And he said that every time they looked for this thing called matter, they couldn't really find it, right? You keep opening it up, and the only thing you could find at the bottom level was a series of yes/no choices or information. And so that's why I said everything that is an it, a physical object, is actually made up of particles, quote unquote, except there are no such thing as particles. There's only information, which are based on bits of which are just bits of zeros and ones. And then David Deutsch, who I just mentioned earlier, modify that phrase to say it's from qubit, right? So which means that the universe really is based on information that is in superposition. Now, what does it mean for a particle to be entangled with another, right? We don't really know the answer to that question, right? We have mathematical theories, we have ideas of how we can use it for quantum cryptography, etc., but we don't really know what that means. But there is some linkage between the information of the particles, right? And so I think in the end we may find that, just as Mark Andreessen is a famous VC in Silicon Valley and who was one of the founders of Netscape, said about 10 years ago, I think, that software is eating the world. And I like to say that information science is eating all the other sciences, right? You look at biology and you get down to genetics, and it's really just about the information that is contained and the algorithms that are run on that information. And same with physics. As you get down to look for matter, you find information. So anyway, that's the answer to the first part of the question. I think the second part is, how will humanity react to this? This is an interesting question, and a good philosophical one. And some people say, well, I'd rather not know if I'm in a simulation. And will people, do crazy things? Will they say, well, it doesn't really matter if I kill people because I'm in a simulation, and this is Grand Theft Auto, and I can do whatever I want? And I say, well, that's not necessarily, the case, because if you're playing one game versus another, sometimes it's important to understand the rules of the game and why you are playing the game. And as I said, in the NPC version, that might be a little more true, but in the RPG version, we've chosen to play this game. And in fact, the religions of the world have been telling us all along that someone is recording everything we do, just like we do on Twitch and we stream it out, right? And so what if we are in a computer simulation and everything is being recorded? Well, that might give you a very different perspective, on how to proceed. So, I think it's just a natural part of understanding our world and our place, within it.
Great. Do we have another question? A question from Jeff. Your thoughts on nested simulations? What would be the purpose?
Yeah, this is a fun topic, nested simulations. And so this is the idea that within a simulation, would the inhabitants of that simulation be able to get to their own simulation point and then create their own simulations within it? And would this process go on ad infinitum? Now, I like to use science fiction examples because the topics that we're talking about here, they tend to border between science fiction, and metaphysics. But there was a great movie that came out in the same year as The Matrix, which was The 13th Floor. And in that, there was a VR type company that had created a simulation, and they would go into the simulation. I think it was in the 90s, and the simulation was in the 1930s in Los Angeles, or 1940s in Los Angeles. And so they'd go in, and the NPCs within that nested simulation wouldn't realize, that they were in the simulation. And then they came back out, and then they didn't realize they were also, in a simulation, a nested simulation. But the people who came from the outside world, which were from a later year, let's say 2021 or a later year, they said, well, we created thousands of simulations, and you're the only one where you actually created your own nested simulations, right? And so this gets into an interesting point about computational power, right? Perhaps the purpose of the simulation is to see, people talk about the great filter, right? Will we ever leave the planet, right? That's one of those kind of big questions. Will we destroy the planet? But another big question is, will we be able to create fully sentient beings inside simulations ourselves? And perhaps that is the purpose of the simulation, is to see if we're able to get there. And yes, you would have to throttle it at some point, right? Otherwise, computer scientists don't like infinity, right? Everything, you end up with requiring infinite computing power. Physicists love infinity, right? But it becomes, I like to call it the new God. It's like, well, infinity will take care of that because there's so many possibilities. But I like to think in terms of processing power, and we don't have unlimited processing power, and so you always have to optimize, and that's what information science is often about. So I think nested simulations are a really fun, interesting area. And I think that they can happen, but only up to a certain extent. Otherwise, you run into computational complexity and problems.
I think we have one more question from the audience. Question from Gerard, sorry. What are some of your favorite sci-fi short stories? Which ones do you think are especially relevant now?
Oh, that's a good question. So, you know, for this book, I ended up speaking with a science fiction author named David Brin, and he wrote the book The Postman, which was made into a movie back in the '90s, and a bunch of others. And he wrote a few really interesting short stories about a future with AR and VR and with simulators, and they would sit there and anytime someone asked them a question, what is the best approach, they would run complete simulations of the world. And the name of the story is escaping me right now, but if you search for David Brin and simulations, it was quite interesting because that was his job, was to create these fully sentient beings that were inside the simulation, NPCs in this case. It was the NPC version of the simulation. But then he would look to see what are all the different outcomes at some point in the future. So I thought that was a great short story. There's a bunch of others as well that deal with AI, including the one about creating a supercomputer and asking it, is there a God? And the answer is there is now, right? After it becomes super intelligent. So these days I tend to spend more time with movies and TV shows. But obviously there are a lot of great books in the science fiction world. Starting with Snow Crash from Neil Stephenson, which is where he defined the term the metaverse, and going on with Ready Player One. But there's a lot of different variations on this idea of downloadable consciousness. So, for example, in Altered Carbon by Richard Morgan, which was made into a series on Netflix, if you read the original books, there's a lot in there about these cortical stacks where they take your entire personality and then they put it into VR, and now you're in this virtual reality world. They also use it to beam you from planet to planet, and so the physical body is just something that the information gets put into, and so it's this interplay between what is physical, what is virtual, what is digital, that I find pretty fascinating.
And I'll also mention there are a lot of examples sprinkled throughout your book from pop culture products that have engaged with the ideas of multiple universes and parallel timelines and all that stuff. So I really enjoyed that as I was reading. One of my favorites is
Yeah.
Run Lola Run, which you mentioned, and in terms of running multiple simulations to get a much better result. So
That's right. Run Lola Run is
mhm.
a great one because you don't know exactly why she's repeating the same events again and again, but it's a perfect example of what Philip K. Dick was saying. We would be experiencing the same things again and again, but perhaps making different choices. There's another short story that I mentioned in the book that is called The Garden of Forking Paths, by an Argentinian, I think, or a South American writer named Borges, Borges. And if you haven't read that, that really touches on this idea of the multiverse. And one of the most fun aspects of this book was what you just mentioned, Sanders, which is all these different science fiction references, ranging from Star Trek to The Matrix to the 13th Floor, but also more recent ones like Fringe and Counterpart, which are all about a parallel universe, and leading up to the superhero, multiverses that we're coming up against now. If you just saw the trailer for The Flash, which dropped, I think, last week, they had an alternate Batman, Michael Keaton, who played Batman when I first saw it at the theaters. Yes, I'm that old. I saw the original Batman in the theaters on opening day, but they're bringing him and potentially Ben Affleck back as an alternate Batman. And so there are quite a few great science fiction stories and books about that depict multiverses. One of my favorites more recently is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, where a quantum physicist basically has his life stolen by another version of himself from an alternate timeline from somewhere else in the multiverse. And it gets into this big question of, what if you'd made different choices in the past? What would have happened? Would you be happier or not happier? And so I won't reveal, what actually happens in the book, but it's definitely, if you're interested in multiverses, I would suggest that one.
Cool. I definitely need to check that one out. So I was wondering, to sort of close things out, how this simulated multiverse theory has changed your perspective on life. Has it changed your perspective on life in any way?
Well, at a higher level, this idea of being in a simulation, I personally find can be empowering in a way because in the same way that when we play video games, we agree to play a particular character in the game. And, we might choose, if you think of the old Dungeons and Dragons character sheets, you might choose to be a wizard or a thief or a barbarian, and you have different attributes. And I believe we all come into this life with different strengths and weaknesses and different, proclivities and inclinations. There are things that we like. I like writing. Somebody else, might like making podcasts or whatever the case is. But, the way video games work is we have quests and achievements. And video games wouldn't be any fun if there weren't difficulties, right, in the game. And so, I think it can give us a better perspective that when we face challenges in our lives, which as we get older, we realize we all do face many different kinds of challenges. One way is to say, oh, why me? Or this sucks, or it doesn't matter. None of this means anything. Another way is to say, perhaps we as a character chose some of these challenges as achievements or quests that we have to overcome. It's a very different kind of video game than the type we create, the quests and the achievements. But so that changed my perspective a little bit on how we view life. And what happens if you don't make an achievement or quest? Well, you can go back and do it again. And so this gets into this idea that we can run things multiple times. And then the other perspective, getting back to what I was talking about in the last example of that science fiction novel, is what if we had made different choices? There's always that nagging what if. What if I had gone to a different university, or if you had married someone different, or lived in a different city, or chosen a different profession. And we all have these nagging, questions, would that be better or not? And now after writing the Simulated Multiverse, I say, relax. There's already a part of you that's done that, been there, done that. And for whatever reason, if we follow the core loop, you've chosen to be in this particular reality at the current moment. But that doesn't mean you didn't get to have those other experiences as well. Yeah.
Cool. So on the topic of choice, what's next for you? Do you have any new projects in the works coming up after this that you'd like to
Well,
share?
yeah, sure. So I'm working, my podcast is called The Simulated Universe, and I'm interviewing some of the pioneers building the metaverse these days. And so I have this theory that the metaverse is a stepping stone, following the stages to the simulation point that I talked about, to a different kind of technological singularity. And so, that's an area that I'll be doing more writing on, and how it relates to simulation theory. And then I'm writing another book about autobiography of a yogi, which is in a completely different genre, which is in the spiritual genre as well. But yeah, and then I'm always writing articles about how technology impacts us. And just today there's an article in the Telegraph about our topic. About the multiverse and superheroes. So I get deep into these different ideas of how the superhero multiverses compare to the quantum multiverse.
Awesome. We will be on the lookout for more great content on simulation and the multiverse. So this has been a really great discussion. Thanks so much again for joining us, Riz. And everybody watching, please be sure to pick up Riz's new book, The Simulated Multiverse.
Thanks so much for having me.